Let's begin with a question. How do you take a process that can be messy, challenging to organize, and frustrating for those on different sides of a transaction? Historically, the mergers and acquisition industry, M&A for short, had cobbled together the well-worn use of Word documents, PDFs, email, and Excel to organize the process of wrangling the necessary documentation and communication to complete a transaction. In this episode, Kison Patel, an entrepreneur and author, discusses his journey to create DealRoom.net, a platform solution to streamline organizing M&A transactions. We talked about how he recognized that the industry needed a purpose-built solution. He set out to overcome the inefficiencies he saw and would connect the entire life cycle of a deal from managing the pipeline of potential transactions to due diligence and post-merger integration. We'll discuss how he integrated aspects of agile project management into the process and added templates and customization to match client requirements. Additionally, we'll discuss the infusion of artificial intelligence into the DealRoom program and how AI is impacting the industry. Kison, welcome to our podcast series.
Nice to be here, John.
Happy you could join us. Kison, you're a successful author, you're an entrepreneur, you're a mergers and acquisitions professional, and you're the host of your own podcast, the M&A Science Podcast Series. Tell our audience about the journey that led you to a career in mergers and acquisitions and the founding of DealRoom.net.
That's a long journey.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting because I didn't finish undergrad. I grew up just at a really short attention span, struggled through college. So actually failed out of college and was finding my way into a real estate career, struggling to sell residential real estate. Somehow met a couple gentlemen that were starting an M&A advisory practice. They recruited me as just a young talent to be on the phones. And what I soon realized afterwards was they, interesting enough, were generating all these leads that were mostly from people of Indian descent that were looking to buy gas station hotels and things of that sort. Jumped both feet in the business on the advisory side, or both buy side and sell side. Did it for a year with the company, left, started my own practice, ended up doing hospitality sales, started with private individual assets, ended up doing corporate work with Kimpton, Extended Stay, and some of the boutique developers in Chicago. And then got an opportunity to work on a bank for sale. And that led me into working in the FIG industry for about 3 years. Did some buy-side work with a couple of the big regional banks and sell-side for smaller community banks. In all, close to 10 years as an M&A advisor, up until the recession in 2007 when everything got flipped upside down. I had to downsize the practice, was working as more of an independent person, doing more of these distressed type of deals at that time period, but wanted to get into tech. And I started a company that ultimately failed miserably, but it was the first time I got to work with software engineers, and I was absolutely intrigued in how they would utilize project management software to build software, which led to the idea of creating a project management tool specifically for M&A, which now today's DealRoom. That started around 2012, and around 2017 is when things really picked up in that business. It took a while, but we found our niche working with corporate buy side. A friend of mine in marketing said, "Hey man, you should do a podcast." And I was like, "What the hell is a podcast?" But don't worry about it. It's going to be the next big thing. You just got to do it. And around that time, I noticed that my own frustration working with corporate, there was no consistency. There was no standardization. There was no go-to playbook on how to do M&A. Every company had their own way about thinking about M&A and acting on it. And I thought, why not interview practitioners and figure out what actually works in M&A and start documenting some best practices. And that's where the podcast M&A Science started around 2017 and has done well. Now after about 9 years into it, we've done a lot of documentation of best practices.
I think it's awesome. I got a chance to listen to some of the episodes. And one of the things, and I'll tell you this, that over the years, my partners and I, we ran a company for almost 40 years. And during that time, we did a few acquisitions. Some went really well, but then as they grew in scale, the complexity, I think, was really beyond the scope of our expertise. What resonated with me was that in every deal along the way, we reinvented the wheel. But we'll talk about as we go through this. And one of the things I found intriguing in your book, and I'm sort of paraphrasing here, that as executives encounter technological advances and increased market competition, they face an inescapable choice: disrupt yourself or be disrupted. The choice to disrupt yourself, you bifurcated to transform from the inside or acquire the necessary capabilities. Can you unpack that for us a little bit and talk about what the struggles you saw companies going through?
I was thinking like the classic case of the Xerox and Kodak, where they just, they even had access to the innovation, but they just weren't taking things to market and disrupting themselves. They were conservative. They didn't want to disrupt their most profitable business lines. Now you just see it more and more with how competitive industries are, and as it become more tech oriented, that a lot of these larger companies, that's what they have to do, is to get access to new technologies, to innovation, and they do need to disrupt their own business to stay ahead. I would even put it outside. I look at the pharma industry too. Like some of those large pharma companies are heavily dependent on doing acquisitions because they can't do that kind of R&D organically and get access to the products they need to continue the growth and achieve their growth. I think that's sort of the big driver. Do you sort of continue down the path and become stagnant over time, or do you constantly challenge your business and look for new ways to innovate and grow?
You mentioned one of the things that you saw was that, and I think it's out in the literature when I did the research on it, was that close to or more than half of all M&A deals attempted fail to meet their projected value. And I believe you had several reasons why that happens. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I think integration planning is probably one of the biggest fail points. One of the things I know, John, you referenced the book Agile M&A, which we published a number of years back. I do have a newer framework called buyer-led M&A in the works, which is more of recent reflections and comparing how M&A evolves in companies as they progress and do more deals. And they usually start from a very seller-oriented process, where the seller drives the M&A process, involved to more of a buyer-led process. And the big driver of that is so that if a buyer controls the M&A process, they are able to plan integration better, and better planning results and better outcomes. That planning allows you to really understand how you're going to execute on the value drivers of the deal. Is it the people? Is it the customers? Is it the technology? They're really spending the time to make sure you have the right pieces to execute as soon as you close the deal.
One of the aspects that I thought was spot on, part of it was the absence of the integration personnel at the outset. That if you leave everything to the finance people and the deal gets done, then they hand it off to the integration personnel that probably had a very good perspective that would have been valuable at the outset.
Absolutely correct. I think that's where you want to think of the whole process as being holistic, that you want to have a continuous end-to-end flow of information, because you gather so much valuable information in early stages of diligence, confirmatory diligence, and being able to ideally have a parallel process. So as you're doing diligence, you can iteratively update your integration plan.
Kison, I wanted to get your thoughts on a phenomenon known as confirmation bias. And this arises when a person, in this case a leader, becomes sort of emotionally invested in a particular deal and selectively focuses on information that supports their convictions while ignoring valid concerns that warn against pursuing the deal. And although they might acknowledge objections, they rationalize them with thoughts like, hey, we can manage that. And that allows their desire for the deal to cloud their judgment. And this can even affect the team's thinking. They'll think like, well, gee, the boss has fallen in love with this deal, so we'll make it happen. And to counteract this, you need to have voices in the room posing challenging questions and prompting leaders to pause and reflect on those broader implications. Perhaps it's a role for an integration team that they could play.
This is known, John, in our industry as deal fever.
Yeah.
It is definitely a known thing. And what happens is you start off with a thesis. That's a big part of pursuing a deal to begin with, that there is some driver, whether it's maybe the customer base, maybe it's this piece of technology that would really fit well into your roadmap and accelerate things, help you get to a certain solution to the market faster. Maybe it's a geographic expansion. Maybe it's just trying to get certain talent, like getting engineers and doing acqui-hire. Something there you get fixated on. But then as you move forward in a deal, little things pop up, these little red flags. And the more time you invest in a deal, it gets harder to walk away from it, especially if you start getting to a point when you're bringing third parties in to help with the diligence and you have more costs incurred, and it gets even harder to walk away from a deal. I've been there. I've seen and understand why. It is a thing, and it's tough to combat. I've heard of organizations I remember I did an interview with 3M, and it was interesting because they actually do a whole red team exercise. So that when they have a deal team that is pursuing an opportunity, they actually spin up a team to build a counter argument against it. And then they both have to present to the deal committee. And the deal committee ultimately decides to do the deal or not. So that was one sort of governance approach to counter this kind of confirmation bias. Another one I've worked with in our own company was, I know my background is doing deals, and since I moved out of an operating role in the business, I'm going to build pipeline for the company, and that's going to come pretty natural. But there's a whole different team, our operating team, that's going to own the integration and deliver on the results of what we're trying to do. So the way we created our governance was that I'll go through a process, identify opportunities, build a business case, but then present it to our COO, and our COO represents our operating team with his functional leads, and they ultimately have to give the go or no-go decision.
Yeah, it's absolutely important. And I think I mentioned to you in our experience, we ran a business before we sold it for about 35 years. I'll never forget the first 2 acquisitions we did. We had such a hard time integrating them. One worked out, one we ended up selling a year later. And it was just that, and the red flags were there, as you pointed out. But you're an entrepreneur, you built your business, you've always believed that you could be successful at anything you put your mind to. But acquisitions are tough, and especially that integration of one company culture into yours. It can be very, very difficult. But yeah, no, I think you do need to have those mature voices in the room to make sure that you're aware of what the red flags are before you put your pen to paper and you sign a big check, and next thing you know, you've got to make it work.
That's the biggest fallout point I hear, is the cultural differences, is why things don't come together post-close.
Yeah, absolutely. Based on your M&A experience, you sort of came to the conclusion that a new approach, a new way of thinking and executing was necessary to increase the probability of successful M&A outcomes. And you landed on integrating key aspects of Agile project management as a way of improving the process. Can you tell us about Agile and how it helps?
Yeah, I'll start with Agile and how today it's evolved into what we call a buyer-led M&A framework. The original thesis was just comparing our own engineering team and just seeing how they're using these Agile approaches, how they use like a Kanban flow, daily stand-ups, and these tools to be very, let's say, flexible and iterative, and just constantly updating priorities to make sure team members are aligned on the highest priority items continuously. I saw this correlation would fit really well with M&A, because a lot of times you end up doing things in these long checklists, and then you start tagging things high priority, and then everything's high priority, and then you just reset and do it all over again. I ended up having conversations with some folks at both Atlassian and Google, and actually validated this, that these are organizations that had Agile as part of the engineering culture, and they have transferred it into their M&A approach. And that's where I saw the big theme of the better you connected your diligence process with integration, better results you had. A lot of these Agile techniques would really fit well in achieving that you can plan integration early, be very iterative about how you plan integration, and then ultimately have a more comprehensive integration plan that you have your broader team and the counterparty aligned on, so that once the deal closes, everybody's on the same page about what needs to get done and what are the goals and the rationale for doing the deal, versus this traditional approach, which a lot of times I'll reference as seller-led. You're just focused on closing the deal as fast as possible. And when you're only focused on closing the deal as fast as possible, the real drivers of what makes a deal successful isn't the priority. Then that turns into a lot of challenges post-close, a lot of confusion, a lot of frustration, some blowouts. And when you have employees that have that FUD, that fear, uncertainty, doubt, that's when it put those teams at risk of employee churn. To me, that's the biggest risk on a deal. As you buy a company, 50% or a number of the people quit, then you're going to lose a lot of value when that happens. So I think that was a big part of Agile, was like, how do you sort of keep this flexibility and really iterative approach so that you can be more comprehensive in how you integrate the companies. And then when you actually go execute the companies, that same approach would actually apply well to be able to keep your plans in place and continuously update your priorities and make sure there's an alignment there. So the things that we've evolved Agile M&A into a buyer-led M&A framework sort of speaks more to the broader view of how the deal should be executed and managed end to end.
Right,
So
right.
when you look at a buyer-led approach now, and this is kind of taking Agile M&A and then adding a couple more hundred podcast interviews, working with 100 corporate M&A teams, and starting to see what that evolution looks like of going from your first deal, which oftentimes ends up being pretty seller-led, and then a company maybe around their 10th deal, you see this big transformation where it's a very much of a buyer-led process end to end, that from the early stages, it is very much about defining your M&A strategy based on this vision for the company.
Right.
That 10 years out, this is where the company wants to be. This is where we see M&A being a tool to accelerate or help us achieve that vision. Based on that, we can clearly define the companies that would fit that criteria into the strategy. And because we have that clearly defined, we can be very proactive to go engage with those companies. And when we're proactive, we can take our time, build a relationship, get to know the leadership team, understand their culture. And when we do get to that point, we can transact. We can do it in a very mutual way, where we can do it on a basis that we're putting two companies together for the greatest outcome. We can be very amicable about the timelines and solving some of the issues that'll come up. That's where that buyer-led, just from the very beginning, you're setting some strong intentions to set up the deal for success. And as you continue through that process, integration is on the forefront of it. That even before you sign an LOI, you have a thesis on how you're going to integrate this company.
Makes eminently good sense. And I think to a very great extent, I see that in the way you've built your process out in the DealRoom.net platform, from pipeline to diligence to integration. And as I mentioned to you before, we sold our business in 2019 to a private equity firm, and I witnessed the difficulty in navigating documentation, discovering the latest revisions. And I found the process somewhat unwieldy. And yet now, if you could tell us how your platform increases better communication efficiency and better organizes the process.
I think that's what we currently see is the old ways. Things are on spreadsheets, emails, information is very disparate. Then what ends up happening is later in the process, when you have to go integrate, you're going to have different folks involved, and then they're scrambling to catch up on the information they need to execute. So they end up rediligencing the deal again. They end up asking for the same information for the company they're acquiring. It becomes very inefficient. You know, the new view, and one of the pillars of buyer-led M&A is that you have your tool set connected with each other, that there is centralized source of truth, a real continuity between your information. So that way, as you go through the different stages, you can repurpose this information. From the early stages, when you move through diligence, you oftentimes gather a lot of valuable information that could be repurposed for integration, or even better, while you're doing diligence, use that information to iterate your integration plan. When we look at the DealRoom software platform, one of the core philosophies is that you can build a work stream for doing your diligence and use that to collaborate internally, the counterparty, external parties, and then build a parallel work stream for your integration planning, which may be limited to some internal folks initially, but as you get closer to close, you may socialize that with the target company so they're on the same page and validate some of those assumptions that you have. And then that's like the beauty of the software, is allowing you to do both of those key activities in the same environment. It's not a separate environment. It's not separate teams, but you can bring in the people to work collectively together on both diligence and the integration planning.
But also, I think it aligns the buyer and seller together, because I think both don't want this process to drag on. Everybody wants to close, right? I mean, so I think just being better organized certainly aligns both the seller and the buyer together in the process.
Definitely information organization is big. Enablement of collaboration is probably the biggest thing I've seen, where on the buy side, you end up having quite a bit more people involved in the process than the sell side. So having a platform or sort of an environment for the buy side to be able to align their different teams so that they can really collaborate so they can manage their priorities, but be able to compare notes. As you come across a finding, you're able to like bounce it off another department so quickly and get their perspective. And all this stuff ends up getting channeled back to the legal team so they can update the purchase agreement. That's, I think, really powerful. That's really unique versus trying to email and do this stuff in silos.
Right, exactly. Interestingly enough, and this is a topic of conversation that I go through with almost everyone today, is that's the integration and the infusion of AI. And you and I have spoken about this, that within your platform today, you've integrated and infused AI in it. And I'd like to get your thoughts on it. How has the market responded? And how do you view the future of AI in M&A? And let's take that a little step further. And how will it change the financing industry?
Yeah, this is really good. Our journeys started last year. We had a few hypotheses on where AI would fit well. I talked to about 40 different customers and landed on the highest investment for us was around contract extraction. That a lot of folks found a good portion of the legal work to be very tactical and not very complex, but they end up paying quite a bit of money to have a legal firm do it. And what we found is every organization has a whole set of customer contracts, employment contracts, vendor agreements, and just a big part of it is going through and extracting the key terms from these agreements so you can identify some of these risks early. For example, John, like one of the first things I want to see from a deal I'm looking at of their customer agreements, which have change of control provisions. And that for me, that's an important thing. I've gotten a deal where we had a big surprise that every single contract had a change of control provision. And it's like, holy smokes, like we have to rethink how we're going to mitigate this risk. And it completely changed the deal terms. And the seller, it was a really tough one for us to figure out. And just knowing those things early, the better to address it with the seller versus later in the process or after you sign the LOI, that's really difficult to go back and renegotiate. So that was one of the areas that we really focused on was just purely extraction of these terms. I would say initially it was tough. About half of the customers that actually expressed interest and want to utilize it would get rejected by the legal department or they just weren't comfortable using AI. So one, I have a view that the finance industry is generally conservative about AI, but that's to change because the results and the efficiency is so undeniable that you're getting such a high level of efficiency leveraging AI that it's going to put you so far behind. I see that really shifting. We're already seeing that shift. You know, I think Microsoft has done a really good job of making OpenAI licenses and other large learning model licenses available on enterprise terms that a lot of these organizations are getting comfortable with. They understand the data is not getting used to train the model. They're getting that level of safety. So that's helping with adoption. Now, the technology itself, really interesting to see how it's evolving. A lot of little startups are popping up with this AI for M&A use cases. A lot of them are struggling with distribution because it's, again, a bit of a slow-moving conservative industry. So a lot of things are just new names they're not familiar with, big question marks about security because it takes some time to really get figured out and go through security review processes with these companies. That's one of the things I've noted. And if you look at the more mature products in the industry, it's a lot of competing priorities. It's something that we really struggled with. It's like you got a lot of things you're already building for existing customers and what prospect customers want. How are you supposed to build the new innovative AI? We had to go rework our whole process where we build a completely separate work stream just for AI development, which is now accelerating it. But what we are developing now is this next generation of AI, and which is taking what we currently developed as contract extraction and now moving it to analysis.
Right.
Like, can we let the AI, and it's a little bit of a different fine tuning. So we kind of build a different model that sort of fine tunes for utilizing an M&A context, but to be able to actually do the analysis. Can we start building the readouts? Can you start building a sequence of prompts, essentially these agents that can go through and you can train it with a sequence of prompts to go do a portion of diligence that you would do and come back with an actual summary and report out. For example, I worked in oil and gas, and for me, I always loved and hated going through EPA reports. And that was a big thing. It's always like key little things you're looking for. Like, A, is there any contamination? B, okay, do we have any underground storage tanks? If so, how old are they? When are they going to need to get replaced? You know, those are key things. But now you can just create some prompts that'll go through, extract that, write it up in a summary, and you're done.
Right. And it also provides attribution, the page within the document, any lead-in paragraphs. I'm sure all of that is so helpful, and it does continue to move that process along. as opposed to getting on the phone with your law firm and then having them put a junior on it for a week and then come back the following week. So yeah, I got to believe it's such a much more efficient process.
That's the exact example, John, too, of fine tuning. Like what you described is like referencing where this information actually come from, because I need to be able to validate that. Like we can't afford any inaccuracies in M&A. But that's a prime example of what a lot of industries are doing. They're taking these large language models and really fine tuning them for specific industry use cases. That's where we're at now. It's taking it into analysis and then also applying AI to the actual process, which is I find really fascinating. That we have usually a set of templates. So if somebody's never done a deal before, we can provide them templates to get them started. Most organizations have something, or they even have a matrix of templates where based on what is the key driver of doing the deal, they'll have templates and then they'll have another set, whether it's a small, medium, large deal. So they end up with this matrix and we usually model that out in the product. But now AI, whether you're starting from scratch or have an existing one, it can tailor it so well for that deal, especially if you provide the comparative context where you give enough context about your organization and the organization you're acquiring. It can customize that diligence list far more accurately than anything out of the box. But what I found really fascinating is that you can do this in a way that's dynamic. And that's what I found really fascinating is now the AI can guide the process. And then we have this vision that the magic's going to come when you can really connect the two together. You can take extractions from these documents, the process itself, start automating some of the connections between the information you're looking for and being able to retrieve it without having to do all that work searching for it. But even taking another example of like automating integration planning, taking all this information you're extracting and sourcing from diligence, but be able to start populating what an integration plan should look like to get a head start on that.
That's brilliant. I have one last question for you, Kison, and this is one I ask all of my guests. What one word describes who you are?
Impatient is the one I hear the most frequently. I don't know. I have to stick to impatient. I think that's just the first word that pops in head.
And what about you that makes you impatient? Is it passion? Is it wanting to move, getting something done? Can you expand on that?
I think so. I was probably past my parents until I was like a hyperactive kid. Like I never sat still. I was always into something. But I think it's a big part when you look at being in a leadership role. It's one thing to have a vision. Like you definitely have to have this long-term vision about where you're going, but you have to have some near-term impatience to be able to drive those results. Even now, taking what we're doing with AI and just seeing that it wasn't moving fast enough because it's competing with priorities. And it's like the impatience takes over. And now we put an effort to put in its own work stream, put its own team there. And now you're starting to see things move faster, but that's a result of not having patience.
Got it. That's brilliant. Hey, listen, thanks, Kison. Thanks so much for being part of our series. I know our listeners are going to get a lot out of this. Thanks so much.
Hey, John, enjoy the conversation. Thanks for having me.
Like with any innovator, when listening to Kison, we immediately recognized that he had a clearly defined problem statement, felt passionate about it, and was focused on creating a novel solution for the industry. Through his experiences in mergers and acquisitions, he recognized how organizing the steps in the transaction impacts time, deal costs, and the ability to succeed. Many transactions follow a series of steps, from engaging with potential buyers and sellers to closing and integration. Traditionally, different organizational teams, such as finance, legal, and integration teams, run these steps by organizing data and documentation using Excel, Word, and email on different platforms. His experience showed that this led to inefficiencies, slowed communication, and limited diverse perspectives. He also saw the flaw of having the seller drive the transaction rather than the buyer, because it undervalued the importance of integration planning, which often becomes a critical point of failure. This led Kison to develop DealRoom, a cloud-based platform built for M&A optimization. It provides a centralized hub for managing a deal's full lifecycle, including real-time collaboration, communication, and data organization. I asked Kison about confirmation bias, or as he called it, deal fever, that intense emotional attachment you feel to the transaction. It's a logical fallacy in which you selectively focus on information supporting your convictions while ignoring those red flags that warn against pursuing a deal. This often starts with company leaders who can infect the team's thinking and rationalize the deal to make sense. Kison pointed out that deal fever avoidance is helped by having everything on a common platform and using that to enhance collaboration. You end up with more voices in the room and differing viewpoints on whether a transaction is worth it. The premise is that you're more exposed to differing viewpoints and less likely to disregard the red flags. We discussed the infusion of AI into the DealRoom platform. He views AI as a critical component in the company's evolution. Kison explained that AI can accelerate diligence, allowing natural language queries to comb through documents and provide attribution. He also pointed out that instead of using standardized templates, with AI you can customize a diligence list far more accurately than anything off the shelf. And the one word he used to describe himself was impatient. You recognize the need for near-term impatience to achieve your long-term goals. Here the lesson is to apply your impatience to look for what's slowing the process down, then focus on the resources and priorities to meet your expectations. We thank Kison for sharing his experience and valuable insights. This podcast is executive produced by John Rebecchi and the New York Institute of Technology in conjunction with the School of Management and the Office of Strategic Communications and External Affairs. Our co-executive producer is Dr. Deborah Cohen, Professor of Marketing at the School of Management. Our social media strategist and producer is Petra Shantaraga, and our audio editor and mixer is Brian Falk from Abacus Entertainment. Special thanks to Professor Ellie Schwartz and John Rolicki from the Office of Development and Alumni Relations for all their support. Until next time.